Steady.
Okay.
Well, Harry, it is good to see you again. Thank you for dropping by.
It's good to be here after all these years.
Yes. I mean, for me, it's like, well, it's getting close to, 85, 99, it's getting close to 40 years.
Years, yeah.
Yeah, so I was here,
Yeah.
and you too, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
So, you came. Why did you come to ICS way back then, from all the way from Cyprus?
Well, I mean, I was a student in the US, and through my contacts in Pennsylvania, I came across Dr. Peter Steen.
Ah, yes.
So it was through Peter Steen that I ended up at the institute here. So that was the connection.
Okay.
Yes, but looking back, I was very glad that I did study here at that time, because it came at an early stage in my postgraduate studies, and what I assimilated from the institute gave me a very, very formidable foundation on which I have been building ever since in some very fundamental ways. The opportunities I had to teach and to practice in the field that I now work, which is the field of international peace and conflict studies, was quite informed by the philosophical foundations that I acquired from the institute. And even though I did not have the chance to, replicate and teach explicitly what I had learned from the institute, nevertheless it gave me a foundation on which I could build and formulate my perspectives in the area of peace and conflict studies. So that has been very, very few words in my trajectory.
Well, it's excellent. I guess, I have to say that a lot of my work in education also is built on work linked directly or indirectly to the Institute and its publications, yes, and so on, and the tradition that has nurtured me. So, yes. So you went back to Cyprus.
I went back to Cyprus right after my studies here at the Institute, and of course I went back to a Cyprus that had been ravaged by a terrible coup d'etat, which was tied to Cold War developments at the time, and also a war. As you know, in '74, soon after the Greek launched coup d'etat from Athens, Ankara decided to invade Cyprus, and it was it was an event that really marked the lives of the people of the country ever since, and the country has been divided ever since, even though it's going through a transition, hopefully for reconciliation and a final comprehensive settlement. But as soon as I went back, I found myself immersed in a situation that was obviously conditioned by conflict. I encountered what in my field now we call a conflict-habituated culture, where the ethnic groups had become completely polarized as a result of the violence. And one of the things that I discovered as I became involved in the issue of peace and conflict in Cyprus is that one of the consequences of conflict is the institutionalization of alienation between groups, to a point where groups that are polarized as a result of conflict, they end up living in two completely different worlds, where one side's villains are the other side's heroes, and vice versa, and everything else that comes into that reality becomes polarized. And the way I got involved had multiple motivations, because I was one of the pioneers that started what eventually became the peace movement in Cyprus. Because up until that time, the communities were completely polarized. Everybody followed the official line, which was again very adversarial in relation to the other side. And we came to the realization, myself and some of my associates, that you cannot really open up a future if you continue to operate out of the adversarial worldviews and frameworks that have conditioned the society. And we ventured into trying to reach out to the other community to find ways to engage in some sort of more direct dialogue that was not filtered through the prisms of the polarized cultures. And that's how I got started. And I remember way back It was very difficult to meet people from the other side because the ethnic communities had become polarized and also segregated. So we were separated with barbed wire, minefields, fortifications, and UN peacekeepers. But we managed to get permission from the UN, and we started meeting in the buffer zone with the other side. And it was the only space, where Greeks and Turks could come together, which again, goes to show that once violence sets in and human groups become polarized, it's as though the world becomes so small that there are no more common spaces where Greeks and Turks could share. It's like, and it really reflects the conflict, namely, what is violent conflict? Violent conflict in its spiritual essence suggests that the world is not big enough for both of us. So I have to either kill you or kill me. And that's how small the world becomes under conditions of conflict. But then we realize that as we engage in dialogue, the first realization was that we live in completely different worlds, because what one side saw as white, the other side saw as completely dark. And initially that was very confusing, but then we realized that this is one of the fruits of protracted conflict. The polarization becomes absolute and the worlds become severed completely. So how then do you build bridges to rehumanize the relationship and to bring humanity back into the situation that doesn't operate exclusively through stereotypes and exclusively through the dark part of history? Because there's also a bright part of history where people did live together, and there was coexistence, and there was mutual respect. So my engagement in this process was to a considerable extent built on what I had learned here at the Institute by reason of faith, first of all. And that element of faith was a very formidable factor in helping me to transcend the polarization, at least initially, however difficult it was, simply because the foundation of faith suggests that the divine transcends human conflict, and in fact the redemption comes from that transcendent vantage point. So as we minister in the world, the challenge becomes, how do I think, how do I formulate ideas, how do I articulate strategies and approaches, and how do I relate to the other side so as to bring some part of that restoration back into the real world. So that's in brief, part of how the foundations that I acquired here, helped me build forward. But there was another point that was very substantive for me in terms of my development, because in a conflict situation there is a lot of talk about justice, a great deal of talk about justice, because the sides that clash violently, they end up with a profound experience of violation and of injustice. But there again, when we came together with the enemy side, as it were, and discussed the issue of justice, we discovered that we had completely polarized views of what we understood by justice for that particular situation. And which posed a greater challenge, that it's only through engagement that we can come to some common framework that can cover the injustices of both sides as a way of opening up the future. But one very interesting development that occurred that refers back to, if I can use the philosophical term, the modal scale. It's very elaborate identity of the modalities and the reducibility, etc., was that there were certain phenomena that were residual to the protracted conflict that justice could not address. For example, the question that constantly came up is how do you bring justice to a family that lost their loved ones? How do you bring justice to a generation that has lost its youth? In other words, there were certain things that fell outside of what we call restorative justice, simply because they were irreversible. If you try to reverse them, you end up with a fundamentalist view of justice that essentially becomes equivalent to vengeance, which is not justice, it's further injustice. And in that context, I realized that the the reference to peace is what transcends those elements with respect to which justice remains mute. Because essentially what you're saying, I cannot bring back the dead that were lost. I cannot restore, the lost youth of a generation. I cannot reverse history. You can perhaps bear the pain, but if you opt for peace, a new future opens up. So the possibility of what is potential within creation opens up when you opt for peace. And of course, opting for peace means managing your hatred. It means managing the natural instinct for vengeance. It means building new relationships that are not defined by polarization, but relationships that are defined by common interest, by a security system that is not based on firepower, but on sustainable relationships. And by so doing, you can now do more in reality together than what you could do on your own under conflicted situations. There is also another point of reference that I think was built on my understandings and what I assimilated from the Institute, and that is the fact that the model scale, as we call it, and I think one of its strengths is that it both guards you from the tendency to absolutize certain dimensions of reality, or to idolize, probably a stronger word, but it also helps you to identify idolatrous inclinations, both in academia as well as in history. And one of these inclinations I identified in the phenomenon of nationalism, ethnocentric nationalism, which is what polarized the country where I grew up, and what led to the violence and the conflict. And it has to do with the idolization of the idea of the nation. And I was socialized in that, from a very early age, which essentially brings human groups to the point where the placing of the idea of my nation on such a supreme pedestal, and attributing to that reality, sacral qualities, brings humans to a point where they are ready to both kill as well as sacrifice their own lives in the name of the nation. And in that configuration, the value of the nation rises above the value of human life. In fact, the nation becomes the arbiter of life and death. It becomes a kind of deity that the human mind sets up. So part of building peace in that part of the world, as a challenge to me personally and to the people that I work with, is how do you desacralize the nation? How do you go past the idolatrous approach to the nation and start looking at the national community as a human community primarily, where the value of human life and the potentiality of human life has more value than this abstract and mystified view of the nation, in the name of which, of course, thousands of lives have been sacrificed. We often talk about the ancients sacrificing human life, but when we see in the context of modernity to what degree the idolatrous view of the nation has legitimized the sacrifice of human life, it's really unprecedented. And that I consider to be one of the most potent spiritual challenges for people of faith. So,
thank you very much. That's
you're very welcome.
very interesting indeed. Thank you for taking the time. I mean, we were going to be sprung this on you, and you have graciously responded